to this video lecture series for ethics. In this video, we're going to dive back into Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and we're going to move on to Book 2. Now, the first thing we should do is just recap where we were at the end of Book 1. And you'll recall that at the end of Book 1, what we talked about was Aristotle's famous function argument, where he basically says that, well, the good of anything is cashed out in terms of what that thing's function is. The function of a human being is activity in accordance with reason, and therefore, how to live a happy, flourishing, good human life is to make your actions in accordance with reason. And what that means is to use your human reason to consider and think about how you ought to act, and then act in that way. Now, this is a sort of broad or very general statement about what the human function is. But you'll notice that in the second part of the function argument, Aristotle gives us a little more indication of what does that mean. What does it actually mean to allow your actions to follow your reason? Well, he explains in the following way. If we take this kind of life to be the activity of the soul and actions in accordance with reason, and the characteristic activity of the good person to be to carry this out well and nobly, and a characteristic activity to be accomplished well when it is accomplished in accordance with the appropriate virtue. So he says there's a connection here between using your reason to think about how to act and acting in a virtuous way. And this is really the first place where we see Aristotle introduce the concept of virtue and vice. And so just to give Book 2 essentially gives his outline of what virtue and vice are, but just to give a very brief summary to get us going, we might say a thing is virtuous, or a thing has a virtue, when it is acting well and correctly in some respect. And it has a vice when it is not acting well or correctly in some respect. Now, we don't usually use the word virtue in this way, but Aristotle would be more comfortable with saying that, for instance, that knives or cars have virtues, to use previous examples, right? So a knife that cuts well, that's sharp, that does its job efficiently, that is a virtuous knife. And a knife that doesn't do those things has the vices associated with a knife. And the same with a car. If it gets you from A to B efficiently and safely, it has the virtues of a car. If an apple tree produces apples in abundance, it has the virtues of an apple tree. And so for Aristotle, anything that has a function will also have virtues associated with it. And the virtues are those things that allow it to accomplish its function well. So the same thing is going to go for human beings. If a human being uses their reason to think about how they ought to act, then the idea is that if they're doing that correctly, if they're acting correctly, they will have the virtues. And if they're acting incorrectly, they'll have the vices. So this gives us a couple questions here. First, we might wonder, what is the connection between reasoning well and virtue? Right? How is it that when we attain the virtues, when we attain these good qualities of character, and some examples of these are generosity, temperance, courage, right? These are all virtues. Loyalty, you might say. How is it that using our reason to act well allows us to attain these virtues? What's the connection there? And more importantly, perhaps in Book 2, one of Aristotle's main considerations is, how do we attain a virtuous character? Right, so if you think about all the virtues I just listed, honesty, generosity, courage, right? What does it mean, just to take one of those, what does it mean to say someone is honest? And what does it mean to say that someone is a virtuous character as a whole? And so to think about this for a second, I want to take an example of honesty. And in his article, What Does Character Even Mean?, the philosopher Christian Miller goes through this sort of conceptual exercise to answer the question, what does it mean to be an honest person? What does it mean to be a just person, a kind person? What does it mean to be someone who has a virtuous character trait? And again, this is important because for Aristotle, if we are fulfilling our function and acting in accordance with reason, then that means we're becoming honest, we're becoming just, we're becoming kind. So we very much need to know what it means to be any of these things. So as a first pass, he gives the following example. He says, let's imagine someone named Samantha. She works in a high-level position, which gives her access to the company's finances and entrusts her with its tax reporting to the federal government. Now, suppose we only know one thing more about Samantha. As she was leaving the office last night, she had a chance to take home some office supplies for personal use, but she did not. Is that enough for us to conclude that she's an honest person? Clearly not. Now, why does he say this? So we imagine someone who says, look, I could steal this office supplies, but I'm not going to. Now, that is an honest action. She didn't steal, and that's a good thing, so she acted honestly in that case. But would that really be enough to say that she is an honest person? And we're talking not just about a single act, but about her character, her person as a whole. We would say, no, that's not enough. And the reason it's not enough is because, for all we know, Samantha could, not steal in that particular instance, but maybe she steals at other times at work. Maybe she goes home and lies to her spouse all the time. So one thing we need to know when we're thinking about, is someone honest, is someone just or kind, we need to know that there's stability over time. Right, because also imagine this. Suppose that Samantha, in fact, was honest in this instance. She was able to stave off her temptation to steal from the company, but tomorrow she gave into it. And then the next day, and the next day. So there's like this one sort of anomaly where she didn't steal, but overall she consistently steals. Well, we wouldn't say she was honest. So to have a character trait like honesty or courage or justice or kindness, we need to see stability over time of you acting in that way. Now, then he gives a second example. Suppose she never takes home any office supplies. So then Miller says, let's imagine that Samantha never steals office supplies. Now do we know that she's honest? Well, like I was saying before, he says clearly not. For we do not know whether she is dishonest in other areas of her work life. She might, for instance, cheat on the company's tax reporting or engage in insider trading. An honest person exhibits honesty across the different situations where honesty is called for. And then he says, well, let's say this person, Samantha, she never steals or is dishonest at work, but again, she goes home and lies to her spouse, or she's extremely dishonest and deceitful with all of her friends. Well, then the fact that she's not dishonest at work wouldn't be enough either. So in addition to stability over time, we're also looking for what we might call consistency across different situations. It's not enough that you're just honest or courageous or loyal at work, or just with your immediate family, or just with your friends. You need to truly be an honest or just or courageous person. You need to exhibit that trait across all the situations in which you find yourself in. And we might pause to think about, well, why do these things matter? Why does stability over time matter? Why does consistency across different situations matter? And I think for Miller, and we're going to see a very similar thing in Aristotle, it demonstrates your commitment to that virtue. If one time you're honest and the rest of the time you're not, clearly you're not committed. If you're committed in certain parts of your life but not others, we might wonder why. Like, let's say you're always honest at work but never at home. Is it because you know you can get away with it at home but you don't think you can at work? And if that's the case, then you're not really committed to honesty in the first place. And this, of course, leads to the third condition, which is going to be very important for Aristotle, as well as we'll see as we continue to read in Book 2. So let's look at the third variation of the example that Miller gives. Again, we can change the example and add that Samantha rarely cheats and lies in morally problematic ways throughout her entire life. So she, you might allow some instances of giving into temptation and being dishonest, but by and large, the vast majority of the time, she's always honest. Now, we have to be able to say that she's honest, right? He says not quite yet. We still have the crucial question of motivation. Why, Miller asks, is Samantha acting this way? If it is because she is afraid of what might happen to her if she's caught cheating or lying, then that's not a virtuous motive. Same thing if her main motivation has to do with making a good impression on others, trying to get ahead, or even trying to earn rewards in the afterlife. So, if the reason you're honest is because you don't want to get caught, or because you want people to think highly of you, or you want to ensure that you can go to heaven, if those are the fundamental reasons why you are being virtuous and honest, then we have to wonder, again, whether you're really committed to virtue. And we're going to see a similar thing in Aristotle. He's going to tell us that the truly virtuous person doesn't just act in the right way, and they don't just do it consistently, but in fact they take pleasure and in fact even enjoy doing the right thing. They take pleasure in doing what is right. They're truly committed to virtue. Now, I do want to pause here in one moment because that seems right. But notice that for Aristotle, remember, he says being morally good, being virtuous, that's what allows you to fulfill your function of activity in accordance with reason. And he says that's what happiness is. That's what flourishing is. Which means at the end of the day, what Aristotle wants to say to the initial question that we posed at the beginning of this class, namely why be moral, why do the right thing, Aristotle's going to say you should do the right thing because that is the only way you can flourish as a human being. It's the only way you can fulfill your purpose. Now, the point that Miller is getting at here is that if you simply have a self-centered or egoistic motivation to do the right thing, then you don't truly have a virtuous character. And I don't want to answer this question here, but I would just pose something for us to think about. Does Aristotle fall into the same trap? If, in fact, doing what is right, becoming virtuous, is ultimately what makes you happy, then is the motivation for doing the right thing ultimately self-centered and egoistic? Is it selfish in some sense? This is something that scholars about Aristotle still debate today, and so it's something I want to have us keep in mind as we begin to think further about what does Aristotle think it truly means to flourish, and what role does virtue play in our flourishing? Okay, so that's basically the concept of what it means to have a virtuous character. You have some trait like honesty, it's stable over time, consistent across different situations, and you have the proper moral motivation. Now, in Book 2, one of Aristotle's primary concerns is not just with outlining what does it mean to have a virtuous character, but how do we get one? Recall that the Nicomachean Ethics is supposed to be a fundamentally practical book. It's supposed to be a book which informs us on how to live a good life, and not just in a theoretical way, but actually gives us advice about how to go out there in the world and become a good person. For this reason, it's actually one of the books that I think about the most in my day-to-day life when I'm wondering whether I'm actually living up and living the sort of life I ought to be, and I think about what is the advice Aristotle might have for me in this instance. And so because that is the case, we're going to see Aristotle first consider the question, how do we become virtuous? And the very beginning of Book 2, he considers the following three sources. He says, here are three answers you might give. First, you might say that people become virtuous by nature, or by teaching, or by habituation. So I want to start by just explaining a little bit about what each of these three possibilities even means. Let's start with nature. To say that we have some capacity by nature would mean that we're born with it. It's inborn in the human species. So for instance, the capacity to breathe, the capacity for your heart to beat and pump blood, the capacity to see and hear, these are generally natural capacities that we're simply born with in the human species. It doesn't mean that, of course, every single person has them, because not all human beings can see, not all human beings can hear. But the point just is that if you have these capacities, it is because you were born with it. It's not because someone taught you how to see, and it's not because someone trained you how to see. You were simply born with it. A second possibility could be teaching. And I think teaching we should take in a wide sense here, right? So right now I'm teaching you because I'm explicitly explaining things to you, but I don't think that's the only sort of teaching, right? You also might think of like a role model. A role model models certain behavior which you can copy or emulate. And so any sort of knowledge or understanding you get from someone explicitly telling you how to do something, showing you how to do something, or modeling it for you, that is what we might refer to here as teaching. And then finally, there's habituation. And this just means you acquire the thing by habit. Or I like to, and what's going to be very important here, I like to think of this also as like training. So if you think about the first way, when you learned how to ride a bike, first your parents showed you how to ride a bike. Maybe they modeled it for you. Maybe they told you explicitly this is how you do it. But then, of course, you got on the bike and you fell over a bunch of times, right? It was only when you trained yourself through doing it repeatedly, through habit, that you finally really learn the skill of being able to ride a bike. So we have these three possibilities: nature, teaching, and habituation. Are we naturally virtuous? Are we taught to be virtuous? Or do we develop virtue through training and habit? Now, one thing to say is, in fact, to a certain extent, Aristotle thinks all three of these sources have a role to play, but his claim is that the primary source of virtue is habit. And the first thing he does is he explains why the primary source of virtue, at least the sort of virtue he's talking about, is not teaching. And the reason he says this is because teaching is primarily the product of intellectual virtue. So what is an intellectual virtue? Well, that means, specific knowledge in some realm, or, you might say intelligence, something like this, right? So if you know how to do a math problem, we might say it's an intellectual virtue of yours that you have this excellence in math. And you might say, well, where did you learn how to do this? Well, you had a teacher that showed you how to do it, right? And so certainly habituation plays a role there because you have to practice, but primarily Aristotle thinks our intellectual virtues come from teaching. But of course, we're not talking about intellectual virtues primarily. We're not talking about how to do math problems or things of that sort. We're talking about virtues of character. And our virtues of character, like generosity and temperance and honesty and justice, it's not just an abstract matter of knowing how to do things. It's a matter of actually putting that into practice. Right? One might teach you how to do a math problem, but that's not going to any way influence you to actually do it. You might have the knowledge and never put it into place. But for Aristotle, it's not enough just that we know what it means to be just or we know what it means to be honest. We actually have to act in that way to have the virtue. And so for this reason, he says, virtue of character is a result of habit or training, as he says, habituation. And go back to the example of learning how to ride a bike, right? Your parents could, before you got on the bike, they could, break down the way in which you do it. Here's how you sit on the bike. You're gonna put your feet on the pedals and pedal in this way. You're gonna steer with the handlebars. They can tell you all those things. But none of that is going to give you either the physical ability to ride the bike until you actually try it, nor will it give you the motivation. But for Aristotle, to say you truly have a virtuous character means you have both of those things. You not only have the ability to act well, but you also have the motivation to do so. And he thinks that can only come through habit and training. So the first thing he says is, and we'll see later how teaching does in fact have a role in virtue, but it's not the primary thing. The primary thing is habit. Now, of course, this leaves one other source, the source of nature. And we might say, well, why can't virtue arise in human beings naturally? I mean, if nature didn't play some role, then you might say, how could human beings ever become virtuous in the first place? I mean, think about the bike example. Certainly you weren't born being able to know how to ride a bike or with the ability to do so, but your nature gave you implicitly the ability, gave you the capacity, just waiting to be developed. So why can't we say that virtue is a matter of being from nature? Well, Aristotle's fundamental reasoning is that our character comes from habit, and he thinks anything which can be changed by habit can't be something that is in us naturally. So let's see what he says. So he says, from this it is clear that none of the virtues of character arises in us by nature, for nothing natural can be made to behave differently by habituation. For example, a stone that naturally falls downwards cannot be made by habituation to rise upwards. Not even if one tried to habituate it by throwing it up 10,000 times. Nor can fire be habituated to burn downwards. Nor anything else that naturally behaves in one way be habituated to behave differently. So he says, look, if you take a stone and you throw it up 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, you say, by habit, I'm going to train this stone to go upward. It won't work. Gravity's always going to win. The stone will always tend down towards the earth. And Aristotle says that's the way it is with all things that are natural in the sense he's talking about. So consider some of the examples of things I said were in you by nature. The ability for your heart to pump and to pump blood through your body. The ability for you to breathe, to see and hear. Now notice, you can destroy all these things. You can destroy your heart and lungs, you can destroy your eyes and ears, you can take away your ability to see and hear and breathe and pump blood. Certainly you can do that. But the way you gain those things is never by habit. Right? So if there's an individual who is born not being able to see, there's no way they can train themselves to see. We might, and actually scientists are working on these sorts of things, we might be able to use a technological supplement that allows a person who is blind to see. That may be possible. But notice, they didn't gain the ability to see through habit. They gained it through a technological implement. So if anything is natural to us, our ability of our heart to pump blood, and our lungs to breathe, and our eyes to see, that cannot be made to do the opposite thing by nature. But then he says, now think about moral character. Think about your ability to be honest. Well, you can certainly change that. For Aristotle, in fact, it's crucial that it is in your ability to make yourself more or less honest. If you perform honest actions, you'll become a more honest person. You'll become more used to it. You'll train yourself to be honest. If you lie, if you cheat people, if you deceive people, you will harm your ability to be honest. You'll make it easier for you to be dishonest. So moral character, he thinks, can be changed by habituation. So it can't be from nature. And what this shows is that Aristotle takes a sort of middle ground view between some people might argue, there was a famous philosopher named Thomas Hobbes who, in essence, argued that human beings are naturally vicious. Sort of like what we saw in Plato's Republic, Book 2, with the argument Glaucon was making. Thomas Hobbes argued, he was an English philosopher, he argued that human beings are entirely selfish, we're just out for ourselves, and because of that, before we institute the restrictions of government, life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So Thomas Hobbes thought we were naturally vicious. Another philosopher writing a little after him, but around the same time period in the 18th century, took the opposite view. He said human beings are naturally virtuous. We're naturally cooperative. We're naturally loving. But it's only after we have to institute the rules of society that society makes us competitive. It makes us cutthroat and makes us want to do harm to others. And in our natural state, we would never do that. So what we see from Aristotle is a middle ground between those two things. We're not naturally virtuous, we're not naturally vicious. It depends on how we act, depends on how we train ourselves. And so we see him at the end of this passage saying, so virtues arise in us neither by nature nor contrary to nature. Nature gives us the capacity to acquire them, and the completion comes through habituation. So you have the ability to become virtuous. And the way you do that is through building the right habits. And if you do that properly, you can attain a virtuous character. But you're not born with it. But you're also not born unable to do it. It's up to your choices. And so we can sort of see this is the way he defines the difference between a natural capacity and a habituated capacity. If you think about a natural capacity like seeing or hearing, first you acquire the thing and then you act. So you're born able to see, and then because of that, you engage in the act of seeing. You're born able to hear, and then you engage in the act of hearing. But things like virtues, or really virtue for him is a skill, and it's important to keep that analogy in mind. Things like virtues, first you act, then you're virtuous. You're not born honest. But you just have to start doing honest actions, and then eventually, when you've built the right habits and character, then we say you're an honest person. But you acquiring the status of being an honest person comes way later, only after you've done many actions. So natural capacities, we have them first, then we act. Habituated ones, we act, and then we have them. Okay, so, and the same is going to be for the vices. Just as we build up the virtues through good habits, so he's going to say we build up vices through bad habits. Right? So he says again, as in the case of a skill, the origin and means of the development of each virtue are the same as those of its corruption. It is from playing the lyre that people become good and bad lyre players. And it's analogous in the case of builders and all the rest. So notice he is comparing explicitly becoming a good virtuous person to becoming, someone who can play a lyre well or a piano well, or someone who is skilled in basketball or football or some other sport. And I think as you read through the Nicomachean Ethics, you really should think about virtue in that way, because it really tells you about the importance of habit. So think about, let's say you want to be an excellent basketball player, and let's say the first coach you have teaches you the incorrect way to choose a basketball, to shoot a basketball. Now, I don't really know much about basketball, so I don't know much about the correct or incorrect ways, but I assume there's bad habits you can build up. And this coach builds in you bad habits. So you're missing all sorts of shots, and you're never going to be starting on the varsity team. Now, then you hire a new coach who knows what he or she is doing, and they attempt to teach you the good habits. What is the first thing they need to do? They're going to need to train you out of the bad habits you already developed. They're going to need to undo the bad work that was done by the bad coach. And this is why habit is so important. It's so important precisely because the more you do something well, the easier it is to do well. The more you do something bad, the easier it is to do it poorly. And just as that is with musical skills, with athletic skills, with intellectual skills, just as with any skill, it also is with virtue. It is the same then with the virtues. For by acting as we do in our dealings with other men, some of us become just, others unjust. By acting as we do in the face of danger, and by becoming habituated to feeling fear or confidence, some of us become courageous, others cowardly. The same goes for cases of appetites and hunger. By conducting themselves in one way or another in such circumstances, some become temperate and even-tempered, others intemperate and bad-tempered. So when you think about your character, think about your ability to be honest, your ability to be courageous, your ability to be temperate, which just means to have the correct disposition towards pursuing pleasure. Think about where you're at right now. Ask yourself, what ability do I have to be courageous in the face of danger when necessary? How easy is it for me to be honest when I know it can benefit from telling a lie? And if you are honest with yourself and you say, in fact, my skills in this area are not that great. If you honestly reflect on yourself and say, I know there's all sorts of times when I know it's wrong to tell a lie, but I know it'll benefit me and I do it anyway. Ask yourself why that is. Why do you think you have this inability to tell the truth? If Aristotle's right, it's simply because you haven't built up the habit of truth-telling. You fed your bad habit. And so it goes for this with the same way for all the virtues, just as with any skill. And that also gives us a path forward. We need to stop feeding our bad habits and start feeding the right ones. Now, I want to consider one other point here on this analogy between skill and virtue. Right? I want to think about, and let's think about the idea of a coach again for a second. I want you to think about specifically in the realm of sports. I think it's a good example. Who are the best coaches? Right? Are the best coaches necessarily always the ones who have the most skill, who are the best players? If you want to become a great basketball player, would you necessarily go to Michael Jordan and assume that he would be the best coach? No, look, I'm not saying he would be a bad coach. I'm sure you could find many people who know nothing about basketball like me who would be worse coaches. But would Michael Jordan necessarily be the best coach? And again, I don't know anything about Michael Jordan. I'm just asking, does the mere fact that he is perhaps the greatest basketball player who ever lived, does that also mean he will be the greatest coach? Well, not necessarily. Because there's a couple facts about highly skilled individuals that don't always make them the best coaches. One, although no skill is entirely formed through habit, highly skilled individuals often do have a lot of natural talent. And so a lot of the challenges that the average person has to go through to develop a skill, that person never had to encounter. And so when someone is doing something incorrectly, they're not going to be able to draw on their own experience of doing that thing incorrectly and help them out of it. Another way in which a highly skilled individual may not be the best coach is that because their actions are so habituated, because they've done it so many times, and now even if it wasn't natural to them at first, now it is, Think about the idea of when we say something is second nature. What does that mean? Well, your first nature is what you're born with. Your second nature is what you train yourself to do. So when we say someone can shoot a basketball as if it's second nature, we just mean they've trained themselves so thoroughly that it now comes naturally to shoot a basketball the right way, to dribble the right way, to play the piano the right way. And so there's all sorts of little actions that they're doing that they don't even realize that need to be explained to someone who's just a beginner. And so the reason I bring this up is because it tells us something about how to help someone become virtuous. The way to become virtuous, if you're, a beginner, may be to model your behavior after someone or ask for guidance from someone who has gone the same sort of path, who's gone through the same sort of struggles of trying to develop a virtuous character. And that may not always be someone who's necessarily highly skilled. Because the path to becoming virtuous is going to be difficult, it's going to be arduous, it'll involve much failure. But if someone has been through that path before, they'll be able to tell you about those pitfalls, recognize where you're going incorrectly. So again, I would just really keep in mind this analogy between skill and virtue. And so we can sort of sum up his basic picture as the following. Because like states act from like activities, we really need to be focused on how we act every day. So you always have a choice. You can either act well or you can act poorly. If you act well, you'll build good habits. If you act poorly, you'll build bad habits. And good habits leads to virtue. Bad habits lead to vice. And this is extremely important advice because you all know this implicitly from times where you've failed to do things you want to do. But it, of course, bears reminding yourself and repeating it. And I'll just take an example. For me, for instance, one small vice I have is that for a time anyway, before I overcame it, I had like almost a quasi-addiction to Cheez-Its. It was to the point where, you would go to the grocery store and I would say, okay, I'm not going to, as long as I just don't buy a box of Cheez-Its, then once I get home, I can't eat them, I'll be fine. So I told myself I'm not going to buy them. Then as I'm pushing the cart through the store, I come to the aisle where they're at. And they always display Cheez-Its so prominently because they're so delicious and everyone loves them. So I get to the aisle where they're at, and all of a sudden I'm rationalizing. My mind is coming up with reasons, why I should buy them all of a sudden. You're like, well, if I could just eat them in moderation and, maybe I'll just separate them into separate bags of portions I should have at a time. And, if I do that, it's not such a big deal. And, I exercise, so I can afford to have a few. So I'm already rationalizing. And that process of rationalizing leads to me buying the Cheez-Its. And then I buy them and say, okay, well, it wasn't exactly my goal, but you know what, I'll just space it out and, it's not going to be a problem. I can just have a little each day. And what would invariably happen is by the end of that day, the whole box would be gone. And this happened pretty consistently. And it got to the point where I was like, I've really built in myself a sort of bad habit that is almost out of my control. And this is somewhat, it's not that serious of an example, but of course this is the material from which addiction is made. Addiction is a real psychological and physiological response to a certain stimuli where at a certain point it will be out of your control. And in order to regain control over that bad habit, it might take therapy, it might take going to a counselor or a rehab facility to disabuse you of those bad habits that you've developed. And so I think one of the main lessons to take away from Aristotle here is that the way you act every day matters, even though it doesn't feel like it. Every time you feed your bad habits of dishonesty or not being generous or not being just, it just feels like one exception, like it's not a big deal. But that bad action will breed other bad action. And before you know it, the habit you built will be something that's not entirely within your control, that you'll have to do some serious legwork just to get rid of. Just as the very bad, basketball coach builds in bad habits that the good coach needs to get rid of later. So I think the main lesson here really is your actions matter, and they all matter. And it's important to be intentional about the way you're acting and the habits you're building. Okay, so I will stop there. I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you next time.